Okay, so welcome to our very much surprise e-learning day on February the 11th. What we're going to do here today, because I had planned for you guys to go ahead and give your presentations over your European theater battles today and possibly tomorrow for fourth hour if we needed that time. Obviously, we're not going to do that. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to finish up just the last little bit of notes on the fighting in the European theater, so that when we come back to school tomorrow, which I can almost assure you that we will be in school tomorrow, we can do our presentations, and then on Wednesday we can move on. We can start talking about the Pacific Theater, and we can also start talking about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. A couple of notes before I jump in and finish just the last couple of 3 slides up. One, I did post this morning a worksheet that's labeled the Chapter 15 worksheet. That is not due until Friday. That is not your e-learning day assignment. But that is going to be due on Friday. Your test over World War II, I'm going to have to put together a couple of different tests that I've done in the past. And so there's going to be some work that's going to be done on that. Suffice it to say, you're not going to be tested over all of the terms from the Chapter 14 and the Chapter 15 worksheet because there's a lot of terms out there. You will not be tested over all of them. I will have a quizzes game put together that will sort of guide you in the right direction as to what to study for and things like that for the test. But you do have that Chapter 15 worksheet that will be due on Friday morning at 8:15. Your e-learning day assignment today is you're going to need to give me your 3 big takeaways just from these last couple of slides. If you were going to distill what I'm about to tell you or relate to you through this lecture down into 3 main takeaways, what would your 3 main takeaways be? They each need to be in a complete sentence, and you will be asked to just do that in a very simple Google post. You won't have to type anything into a Google Doc or anything like that. You'll just post it there on Google Classroom. So with that being said, I think we're ready to jump into this. I think we covered this for the most part in terms of Stalin in late 1943 is urging the other allies, England, the United States, what is left of France, you need to attack and open up a new front. And that's where we have that picture of the Tehran Conference where the big 3, Stalin, FDR, and Churchill, they plan Operation Overlord, which is D-Day. And the plan for attack was to stage it at Normandy, which, as you can see from the map down there at the bottom right across the English Channel from Britain. 150,000 Allied troops are going to invade the beaches of Normandy on June 6th. This date gets pushed back a couple different times just because of bad weather and things like that. We also talked in class on Friday, I believe, at least in fourth hour, we talked about the hedgerows and how after taking the beaches of Normandy, there's another 1 to 2 million men who have to push towards Paris. And Paris is finally liberated on August 25th of 1944. So you can see there a little bit over 2 months. It's not that great of a distance from Normandy to Paris. I think we've looked it up before in class when we talked about D-Day before, and it's an area of land that if memory serves correct, it's not much wider than the state of Indiana. And yet it takes over 2 months to push and to liberate Paris. So that kind of gets us caught up to speed. Again, that should be a little bit of review. Now, while all of this is going on, or excuse me, after all of this happened, sort of during the planning and the run-up to and then the execution of the invasion, there is a presidential election going on in the United States. Roosevelt, who we've seen several pictures of, he's pictured there again in the top left. Roosevelt breaks precedent, and he again runs for a 4th term, and again is elected. And you can see the electoral map down there at the bottom. The electoral vote is a runaway. The popular vote, believe, if memory serves correct, it's the closest of the 4 elections, but I would have to go back and double check that. And we've talked about Truman a couple different times, and now Truman sort of bursts onto the stage. Truman was picked as his vice presidential candidate by the Democratic Party. You see there, just because of his good, non-offensive reputation. Essentially, Roosevelt and the Democrats knew that, maybe there's a little bit of fatigue on the part of the country in terms of, we've had Roosevelt now for 3 full terms. Maybe there's a little bit of fatigue with the Democratic Party. And so they're not going to pick somebody who's an outlandish character or somebody who's going to make these grandiose statements that, could be taken as offensive to, voters. And so they picked Truman because he's very much not a well-known actor. I believe he's a first-term senator from Missouri. He's a former farmer. We'll talk more about the character of Truman as we move forward. But he's picked as the vice president, not really as an afterthought, very much for a political reason, but that's going to become a very big deal because, as we all know, and as we talked about before, Roosevelt was never in great health. And so his picking of Truman is going to have some pretty big consequences moving forward. But before we can get to that, we're going to finish up the fighting in Europe. After liberating Paris, the Allies continue to push the Germans back towards the German border. And at this point, it's a pretty steady retreat for the Germans. They're on their heels. The Allies, continue pushing, and the Germans very much sort of strategically retreat. We don't see the Germans, burn villages in mass or burn fields in mass like the Russians did in the East in the run-up to Stalingrad. But they certainly are taking sort of a tactical retreat. They sort of have it in the back of their minds that we are going to make an offensive eventually. And they do once the Allies push them sort of back into Germany along that shared border between Germany and France. And that's where we get the Battle of the Bulge. As the Allies continue to try to push into Germany towards Berlin, Germany makes one last sort of desperate offensive. And you can see the map there in the top left. That yellow area sort of represents that bulge in the Allied lines, where Hitler and his generals, they concentrate all of their offensive firepower at this one area. It's a forested area. It's a very difficult place to fight. They use that to their strategic advantage. They push through it, and they're widely successful. But as we talked about before, what eventually happens is they outpace their supply lines. They literally start running out of actual gasoline. Their supply lines become targets, and so it's really a failed offensive. It's sort of their last gasp, but it does fail, partially because the Allies now can really start to heavily bomb German cities now. So not only do you have this bulge that's sort of exposed on either side, but now the Allies, as they push closer, they can now start to bomb German cities, which really takes a toll on the German war effort. Again, you also have, and this is something that we tend to forget about after the talk of D-Day, you also have the Russians on the Eastern Front, and the Russians are sort of steadily moving towards Berlin as well. It's sort of that classic German war conundrum, is that we're fighting this two-fronted land war. They also start to liberate the concentration camps and extermination camps as they move through Germany. And this is where the real horrors of what Hitler and his Nazi regime had been doing are exposed. This is something that's sort of lost to us on historically, as we tend to think, well, how could they not have known that Hitler was this terrible person? Well, because, as much as we talked about countries having spies embedded within certain countries, Hitler was very, very good at concealing these things. And so there was some understanding that, yes, there are some horrible things going on, but the extent of which we knew about those things were not really revealed until we begin liberating these concentration and extermination camps on the way to Berlin. Hitler is going to commit suicide on April 30th, 1945. Obviously, if you are a conspiracy theorist or if you are a fan of conspiracy theories, you'll know that there is a very popular conspiracy theory out there that this person that committed suicide was actually a body double of Hitler's, and that he actually, one of the more popular ones is that he boarded a plane that flew to, I believe it's Argentina, and that he sort of lived his days out in Argentina, sort of always trying to plot, the return of the Nazi Party. No matter how you slice it, though, whether you believe the historical record that he committed suicide or whether you believe the conspiracy theory that he flew the coup to Argentina, the Allies do capture Berlin days after, and at that point, the war is ostensibly over. Germany surrenders on May 8th, 1945, and that is what is celebrated as the E-Day, much like we have two theaters. That we think of having two theaters here in American history. We have the European Theater of Operations. We have the Pacific Theater of Operations. We also have 2 days that the war ostensibly ends. We have VE Day, which is in May of 1945, and then we have what is called VJ Day, which we're going to get to after you guys do your presentations. Earlier in April, though, FDR passes away, and now you have the inexperienced Harry Truman as president, who has to oversee the rest of the war in the Pacific Theater, which again we'll talk about later this week. But he also has to oversee sort of the rebuilding of Europe and what is the United States' role going to be in that. How are we going to play with the Russians? We're going to find that Truman very untrusting of Stalin, as he probably should have been. But Truman is not ready. He does not feel like he's ready. He's a really interesting character in that he does not feel like he's ready, and yet once he sort of composes himself and realizes the gravity of what he has been called to do, he really, I think, does a fairly admirable job on the world stage for a guy who, I believe I've read an article before that talked about how Truman wept when he heard that FDR had died because he didn't feel like he was ready to take on the presidency. And with that, as you can see, this is where we'll pick up after you guys' presentations. Is we're going to sort of rewind and reset the clock. We're going to go back to right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and talk a little bit about the Pacific War in class. So your e-learning day assignment, which is going to be stated in Google Classroom, is after you've watched this, and I will be able to see how much people watch this because of the watch statistics that YouTube puts out. After you've watched this video, just give me your top 3 takeaways, sort of distill the big points down into 3 main sentences that you took away from this as we sort of move forward and start to prepare for the end of World War II. So with that, enjoy your surprise e-learning day, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.